Welcome to the Think JSOC webinar series, brought to you by the Office of the Vice Provost for Strategic Engagement. Today, we are pleased to present a distinguished guest speaker. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOC network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or U.S. SOCOM.
Hey, good morning, Mike. It's great to see you.
Dave, good to see you. Thanks for having me.
So, we're very fortunate today to have Col Mike Obadal. Mike has over 20 years working with the interagency and intelligence community at the tactical, operational, strategic levels. He has worked in parallel with at least 7 CIA stations and embassy teams. He is currently detailed to the IC in a senior advisor position. And so we're very lucky to be able to learn from your rich history, working with both the interagency, the IC, and some of our partners and allies. So thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, again, I appreciate it, Dave. And I think what you guys are doing is exceptional and trying to make sure that our SOF operators are as educated and experienced as possible when it comes to the critical relationships that we have with the IC and the interagency.
Well, thank you, Mike. And unless you have some other ideas, I thought I'd just jump right into the questions.
Sounds great.
Okay. The new National Defense Strategy's description of integrated deterrence highlights the importance of incorporating ally and partner perspectives, competencies, and advantages at every stage of defense planning. This seems to me to move beyond the mere rhetoric of statements like this and to actually achieve integration. We must have military practitioners more knowledgeable and aware of the interagency, the IC, for example, and our partners and allies. Can you comment a little on how you have successfully navigated the interagency and the IC throughout your career and have also worked with some of our partners and allies?
Yeah, well, first, I think successfully navigated may be an overstatement for what I've been able to do. I've muddled through with the help of a lot of really good people and mentors and peers. I'll start by saying I think that especially the IC, but the IC-DoD relationship is really complicated. It's a messy marriage of 75-ish years. Both of us certainly need the other. Neither of us, I think, fully understand the other, and we rarely get along. Within that, right, SOF has an even closer relationship with the IC, and I believe than broader DoD, and I believe that has to do really for a couple of factors. One is our SOF operations throughout, especially the last 20 years, but throughout history, I think, have been predominantly intel driven. At the tactical level instead of objective driven. So for instance, kill capture a specific individual, countering a network influence and upstream defeat, and some of these things are very intel driven operations versus what we find in big DoD, which can be geographic focused objectives, regardless of the enemy situation. That's the first reason. And so I think there's a natural marriage between SOF and intel, the intel community. That's grown and grown over history. And the second is exactly that history. There are decades of SOF and the IC working side by side, units, programs, operations. So you have leaders and you have operators that have relationships that go back years and years, and they have similar skills. They use similar types of tools and other things like that. So that's just to, in my mind, caveat the SOF and IC relationship that's critically important. When we go into some of the things that I've learned, right, how we should approach a DoD and interagency relationship, there's probably about 4 principles that I can think of. One is recognize that integration is a necessity for DoD's mission success. We learned that as a joint force, we had to rely on the other services to find mission success. We're still in the process of learning that about the interagency and DoD mission success. The second is view interagency operations as important as joint operations. So we spend a lot of time educating officers, because it's mandated by Congress, on joint operations and joint doctrine, yet we probably don't spend even 1/10 of the time on interagency operations and interagency education. The third sort of principle that I've found is you have to make it a priority. And that means not saying that it's a priority. It means that you have to apply leader time and then people and billets and effort towards that partnership. And that means taking it away from someplace else. It's something that you really, that's important to you. You have to take those resources away and apply it to the interagency and intelligence community partnership. And then lastly, as far as principles, we have to educate our SOF personnel from initial indoctrination into SOF on the interagency and IC, how they operate and the relationships that we have. And that's where I think what you all are doing is really critical. Those are the principles that I've sort of absorbed over the years. When I look at how we do this in practice and the things that I've watched, I see the relationship and the partnership from the DoD standpoint as a pyramid. And you have a base layer that is constant, it's day to day. And for us, it's the embedded LNOs that exist in those organizations. Day-to-day communications and relationships with the right level of leadership. On top of that, you have to build a middle layer, which is your mid-level leaders throughout SOF have to engage in person and virtually with their counterparts in the IC and the IA. And it's supported by, and it is catalyzed by the LNO network that exists day to day. So you have now day-to-day constant communications. Then you have this middle layer that's a little bit less constant, but is very content heavy. And it's where you have new ideas that really start to take shape between the two organizations and the framing of concepts. And then the final and the top part of that pyramid is your executive level interaction. And that's when you have the general officers, the flag officers, the executives, they come in, you bring them into the IC, or the IC executives visit some of the DoD. And that's where you need to have well-prepared, coordinated asks from both, and that you're making agreements on how to move forward on initiatives. All of that has to be present for progress to occur, right? If you don't have that base integrated LNO layer, then the middle layer is not going to happen with your mid-level leaders and the generation and framing of new ideas. And then ultimately, if you don't have that flag officer involvement, then you can't ever get to driving an initiative forward. So what I have watched over time is there's a lot of flag officer and executive level interaction that are somewhat hand wave and wave top type discussions. And they're, while entertaining and certainly enlightening conversations and interesting conversations about, China and Russia and Putin's intentions, or the Chinese technology problem, they're not substantive from the standpoint of driving any more initiatives forward for SOF or for the IC. If those engagements are backed by the rest of that pyramid and they're driven to a specific point for both sides, then that's when we start to see real progress and things start to take shape. So that's in that pyramid. You have all those different layers, right? But you have to invest in all levels of a relationship. And so what I've come to find here is, and I think this becomes really important as we look at integrated deterrence, because we did a few of these things over 20 years of counterterrorism, we were able to work well together with certain things in CT. But as we all know, working integrated deterrence with peer competitors or near peer competitors is a far different task. Sophisticated enemy with sophisticated collection capabilities on the United States, a global presence in both cases. It involves the politics of numerous countries that not everyone is going to align the same way that they align for counterterrorism. So when I watch how we interact with specifically, I'm thinking about the IC right now, right? We are pretty good at liaison. So we have command level reps that are covering broad topics on a daily basis. And they're an inch deep, but they're very broad across whatever organization that they're embedded in. We're probably properly positioned in this, and when I say we, I mean SOCOM right now, right? SOCOM is probably properly positioned in this area, but I think we have a misperception of the role, right? We underestimate their importance, but we overestimate their access. And so we don't think that they are as necessary as they probably are. And yet when we think, well, we have someone in this agency or we have someone in this department, we overestimate how much they can actually get into the details and they can understand things, because it's only one or two people in most cases, and they can't cover that. So to me, that's the first sort of layer of investment in this is liaison, right? You put a couple of officers in there. And like I said, I think we're pretty well positioned from a SOCOM standpoint. The next level is coordination, and that's operation. Usually it's operation specific. So teaming for defined periods of time. This happens, I think, pretty well overseas in many cases. And you think Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, now with the Ukraine crisis, there's operational focused coordination that's going on, but it will end at a certain time. We've done this in the States for certain things. It can get a little bit clunky and awkward because there's no true mechanism for this coordination at the operational level to occur. And so we probably need to get better at this through some of those middle level leader engagements and through a little bit more continued investment by people into the IC and the IA. The last, layer, I guess, or the last, searching for the right word, last level of partnership would be, I would say, is integration. And this is now where when you are integrated, you really start to see the payoffs. These are full-time officers, NCOs, and civilians that from DOD, from SOCOM, that work inside the tactical level departments of the State Department and the IC. When you have those people in there, right, and this doesn't really exist enterprise-wide. You have a few of them from JSOC really, but some other units. You have all three layers, right? You have liaison that works across the surface on a broad spectrum of topics. You have coordination that occurs for specific periods of time on operational tasks, but then integration is they work for a tour day to day down in the basement of whatever agency they're in, and they are alongside their counterparts from that agency. And that's when we really start to see the synchronization of DOD's operations, or specifically SOCOM's operations, into the IC and the IA. So I'll stop there and see if there's anything that I talked about there that's that you think answers that question, or some of the things that I've seen over time there.
No, I think it's fantastic. I liked your point about the investments in education and the LNOs. From my experience as being an LNO between two organizations, It seems like LNOs are often an afterthought, right? We're still very much parochial in our approach, and we don't value that experience of, not just the access um, or, that's created, but the experience of that individual in understanding another institution, another culture, and putting together this big, national security environment, and understanding how the pieces fit or don't fit within it. And so I think that's a very interesting perspective. And then the other one, it also got me thinking when you were discussing the integrated. There is a difference between being an LNO somewhere and actually operating or serving in a capacity that's very similar to one of their own individuals, and I think it gives you a different perspective because you're not representing the equities of your institution. You're actually like you said, integrated, and it gives you kind of a different appreciation. And kind of tying that with the education, kind of two thoughts on that. With the education, I never thought of it. I hear people saying we need a new Goldwater Nichols that's focused on the interagency, but I've never heard anyone articulate it as you did. And I think it was very important. I like the way you said it is, hey, we've invested in joint education, and it has been successful, but we need to really invest into interagency education. And it actually had me reflect. One of the interesting things I saw on PME is we did realize that it wasn't just DoD and the military, but it was often a hand wave on the other. So for example, we would do an exercise in a PME course, and they would say, okay, we need a whole of government approach. And so you, major, will represent an ambassador, right? And you will play the role of ambassador. And it actually reinforced bad habits because, of course, that major could not bring the perspective of an ambassador. It was still, we were playing interagency. We weren't learning interagency. And I think, back to, the education, and I'll highlight a program that you're a product of, the College of International Security Affairs, and this concept of what I call integrated education, to where you have interagency partners and allies in the same classroom interacting. So you're not just playing interagency, you're actually hearing the perspective of State Department, of Department of Homeland Security, of others, of the intelligence community, and some of our partners and allies in that classroom discussion.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the CISA, the College for International Security Affairs, and you and I both have experience with that. And I for one, when I reflect on my year in CISA, which was 60% foreign officers of the student body, and then of the remaining 40%, about half were from the interagency, from the U.S. side. About half were from the interagency. So I was in the minority as a uniformed military officer, and that was a absolutely superb environment to be involved in, because no offense to all of the PhDs that were on the faculty there, but I learned a significant amount more from the other students in the year that you spend with them. It was really educational, and then of course you have those relationships going forward, as we've discussed before. But that type of professional military education is probably not sustainable at scale for DoD to do that. But I think that there's certainly much more investment that we can do without going outside of our budget to include the interagency and the IC and our partners, and with the goal and the intent to make DoD better at understanding its partners and allies and its own interagency.
No, I think it's important, and not offended at all, because I agree with you. It's not, it's not the professor behind the podium that I think really makes a difference in those environments. It's the blending of students. that makes a difference. And I think one of the arguments that I try to put forward is that, hey, in the experience, when you mix the class, it benefits the soft practitioner who is in the class to have that diversity within the class. And so, it's part of, you have to have that diversity to really get the level of educational experience for the soft practitioner. If not, you're just going to replicate, their normal day-to-day environment of seeing everyone else in green US uniforms and not getting the perspective that's needed to really operate in an integrated deterrence type of approach that all of our strategic documents are talking about now.
Yeah, and diversity of experience, diversity of thought, background, culture is really highlighted in a program like that, where in my small group, I was one of, I think, 3 uniformed officers out of 15. And then you have, it's really difficult to replicate where you have the Sri Lankan colonel that fought the Tamil Tigers and the Egyptian, lieutenant colonel that had served in the Sinai for 6 years, alongside a State Department officer who was promoted to the executive level following, and an FBI agent that was, moving up through the ranks, all in one small group, and all being able to have the discussions, I think is really, really superb opportunity for soft operators.
Well, kind of carrying on, I guess, in the same theme, you have, led interagency teams, coalition teams. What are some of the lessons that you've learned from that experience about the importance in understanding the differences in whether it's interagency cultures or actually like national cultures through your experience?
Yeah, so that's an important part, is understanding as you come into it, which candidly, the biggest challenge I had through all of this was the 27 nation task force, where we also had, a dozen U.S. agencies alongside the DoD. I learned as I went along, and I wish I'd really had this perspective before I went into it, because I would have been a little bit more effective, I think. Understanding the cultural differences, not only between, it's obvious between U.S. military and the Italian military, or Spanish, or, pick whatever European country, there's obvious cultural differences there. But between us and our own intelligence community and our interagency. So when you bucket military, interagency, allies, right? Let's talk about how we define success. For us in the military, it's fairly straightforward. Success is defined in a mission statement, and it is that we have completed that mission. We have tangible effects. Something is destroyed, it's dead, it's captured, it's seized. There is some sort of tangible effect, that we have a stated mission with a defined end state. In the interagency, it's not that at all. It's incremental progress. So incremental progress, quality of reporting, continued relationships, things that matter to a country team are very slow, incremental process of a broad range of topics that are important to the United States government and, whatever country that they're in. So they do not, in many ways, have this well-defined end state and a tangible result that they are seeking. When you look at our allies, right, when you're working with allies, their definition of success may be very narrowly defined, and it may be in accordance with a national mandate that they have to achieve 1, 2, or 3, or A, B, or C. And I found that overseas is we would be pushing for something that we saw as this would be success if we found it, and our partners, our allies, would come back and say, Hey, I support that, but my national mandate limits me to these specific things right here. And that's how I define success, because I can report those things back, and that'll be seen in my capital as successful. So that's how we define success. Broadly changes across that spectrum of military, interagency, and allies. The second is, how do we communicate? And we all know, everybody knows in the military, we communicate very directly. We have bullet statements on PowerPoint slides. We use an overabundance of acronyms, and it's for good reason. It allows us to communicate a significant amount of information quickly to each other, and do it without any question. We also we communicate very directly, and from that, in a very definitive manner. So if you think about it, Task Force 34 will ... That's a definitive statement, right? These are things that are orders produced and mission statements. Let's contrast that to the interagency, State Department, CIA, everybody that, DIA. They communicate in a little bit more indirect manner. The language is far more corporate. It's a bit more flowing than it is bullet statements. It's narratives instead of PowerPoint slides. They keep their language very flexible. So, for instance, they use terms like "we assess" or "it is possible." It keeps things flexible so that they can be changed over time. And that's a stark contrast to the way that we communicate in the military. And then you get to the allies, and you have, obviously you have some language barriers, but even with the best ESL speakers, right? If English was not their native language, in many cases they don't pick up on certain nuance. They certainly don't pick up on certain humor. And then, depending on where they're from, their approach to a conversation will be far different, because some like to be very direct, and it almost seems to an American, it can seem very rude and rough, right? The way that they talk and the way that they state statements of fact. And I'm, not to characterize unfairly, but the Dutch and the Germans are very matter of fact and to the point. They don't like superfluous words. They don't like unneeded conversation, as opposed to when you're dealing with the Italians or the Spaniards or the Arabs. It's a very social discussion. And if you get into the meat of the discussion too quickly, then that's a bit of a cultural faux pas. If you have to socialize for a few minutes or even longer before you get to whatever you're trying to discuss. So I think that there's a vast difference in how we communicate, and you just have to recognize that as a U.S. military member, that we're in a very small group in the way that we communicate and the way that we're comfortable communicating. The last thing that I would say culturally that varies is how we make decisions. In the military, it's courses of action. We present decision. We even train our officers to present decision briefs. So much so that at the end of them, sometimes you see the block that says decision approved, not approved, or something else. And it's to force a leader to make a decision so the staff can get on with its life and do something else. We're very course of action driven, right? We have quantifiable metrics that we like to apply to things when we're making decisions. We have a risk matrix that the military invented a long time ago to say, of all the courses of action and all these factors and how we weighted them, here's the best course of action, because it's 37, and it's a greater number than all the rest of the courses of action. And there's merit to that, right? We also like to make decisions quickly. So even though all of that process occurs, we never want to push off a decision. And it goes back to that decision brief that says, what's your decision here? Approved or not approved, right? One of the two. And when you look at the interagency, it's absolutely not how they do things, right? They like to have options, right? And they discuss what those options may be, and they start to flesh out the meat of those options through robust discussion. It's not in every case structured the way that the military does its briefings. It's very inclusive of a number of folks in the interagency when these discussions occur on how they build options. They like to coordinate between departments. So in the military, decisions are a specific chain of command. The other chain of command doesn't really have a say in it. And in the military, you get used to people saying, that's what was decided and that's what is happening. In the interagency, what you find is widespread coordination on specific viewpoints and position papers amongst a number of departments and centers. And then ultimately that gets up to the top. And in many cases, the top, the folks at the top will say, hey, okay, so we have generally what we think and is coordinated, but do we need to decide right now? How much, do we need to do anything right now? Or do we need to just understand that we now have a greater appreciation for the problem and we may get to a point where we have to make a decision? But if we don't have to decide anything right now, then we may not. So that's that interagency way of making decisions. I think finally you'll find on the allies is in many cases, their decision making will be centralized back at their capital. They one of two things: they'll be decentralized, and their officers will be able to make decisions right there, and they are not used to having robust processes for course of action development and other things. So they make decisions right there based on what they think is the best thing, or they have to go back and put this back into their capital for a decision. And a lot of that has to do with national policies and alignment with U.S. policies. So there's some sensitivities there that we don't always appreciate. Obviously we're larger than almost every ally we work with, and it's important for them to, in many ways, be aligned with the United States, but they also have other considerations based on, geographically where they are and politically, who's in charge. So those are kind of the three cultural differences that I see: how we define success, communication, and then how we make decisions.
I think you have me sitting here reflecting and wondering. You highlighted the military culture of really certainty and decisiveness. We will aggressively, and it seems to me that is necessary when there's clear military objectives. You need to take this hill, you need to defeat this army and achieve these military conditions. There's actually some negative consequences, it seems to me, with that cultural aspect, potentially in like great power competition, where maybe the certainty or the aggressiveness could be counterproductive, and that the other organizations, uncertainty, as we would say in the military, or a little more questioning and admitting to not fully appreciating, might actually be a better mindset to have when approaching some of these more difficult, nuanced, great power competition environments.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that goes back to sort of how they like to keep all their options open. And when it comes to Russia and China, I mean, let's be honest, we cannot be decisive in certain things because of the number of ways that we can be countered. So we have to remain very flexible in certain ways, especially in the Pacific. I think we've seen Russia is getting bogged down now, and we can be a bit more decisive in certain ways. But before the Ukrainian invasion, I think what I watched was, and this was from the NSC on down through the IA and the IC, was a desire to continue to have some flexibility. And as we became more and more engaged, we were able to become more decisive. We are still in that position in my mind when it comes to the Pacific and China. We don't know what's going to happen with Taiwan. So what does integrated defense in the Pacific really mean? Are we going to defend, or do we want to deter? If we define that too narrowly, do we give then China a roadmap for how they can achieve some of the goals that they want? And so that level of thought that can be very difficult for Indo-PACOM and for those that have to do things militarily, that open-endedness that may be necessary to really sort of counter China is where I think the IC and the IA are comfortable operating. In my mind, it's very critical from the military to take a step back from that desire to be very, very decisive with how we do things and keep things a little bit more open-ended, because then we may give a bit more pause to China on some of its initiatives and its desires in the Pacific. I think it can be argued that could have the opposite effect as well.
It's interesting. When I would work with interagency and they, weren't taking certain actions, I would often hear military leaders either say or imply that they're not taking actions because they don't have the capacity or capability to do it. I actually heard a senior leader once say, "We're the only ones who can do this." And I would sit back and I would reflect. I'm like, and I think this is to your point, or are we the only ones who can do this? Or are they not doing it because they think it's just a bad idea? Right. So we shouldn't view inaction as an inability to take action. Maybe they just don't think it's a good idea. It also reminds me of a great article. I think it's by Daniel Kahneman. I can't remember his co-author, by Why Hawks Win, which really talks about, and if you think about it from the military standpoint, they culturally kind of like this. Hawks who speak in certainty. If we do A plus B, C will occur. And they're decisive and they're certain in their words. While, in comparison, what Kahneman calls doves, they'll say, well, it depends. We think if we do this, this will happen, but we're uncertain, and it's not as decisive a language. And oftentimes, policymakers in his argument likes the decisiveness of the Hawks. But as we've seen, I would argue over the last 20 years, often that decisive language, that certainty, is often incorrect. And there's some positive nature in being uncertain, in exploring some of these environments, and trying to gain understanding over time, that the Hawks can actually lead us in a bad direction. So maybe culturally, there's stuff that we in the DoD can learn from our brethren in having that more dovish outlook on some of these issues.
Yeah, and I honestly, I hesitate to I don't, from a practical standpoint, don't know if I want to get dragged into a discussion of hawks versus doves and taking one side or another and categorizing one as the other. Obviously, the military is a bit more hawkish than others, or has been in the past. There's always an argument to be made that military senior leaders are in some ways the last ones that want to commit U.S. forces to combat. But when we're talking about operations short of combat, I think that's where the military leans forward quite a bit and more aggressively than our State Department or our intelligence community. And I think the concerns from the intelligence community and from state are that some of these aggressive actions short of armed conflict can potentially inflame things in other areas. And that goes to, some of the things that I've had the opportunity to get the perspective on is we see our actions as binary. We do X and we achieve this thing, this whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish. But what they're viewing is all of the non-binary actions that are around that are the second and third order effects that we never think about and we don't see, including responses of nations that aren't even involved. And so they have, I think, in my mind, a very broad perspective that we don't always think about, even at the executive level in the military, that we don't think about the second and third order effects as broadly as the interagency does. We tend to think of military operations as linear.
So, I guess to that point, you have this vast experience with 20 years working with, the interagency allies and partners that has been this, experiential education for you. What would you recommend for others who are, maybe who do not bring to the table that amount of experience or education through experience? What would you recommend them, or how would you recommend that they prepare intellectually to operate within these interagency allied partner environments?
Yeah, I think that's important because as the institution, be it SOCOM, DoD, I think continues to apply new principles on how it interacts with the IC and the IA. We have to have individuals that are adept at these relationships and at these interactions with these interactions. So I think that you need to have some of your own personal principles that you approach relationships with, right? So remember that DoD is enormous and the IC and the interagency is not. Frankly, they get military fatigue. The number of military visits and the number of military officers that come through to sit down and want to discuss things with a regional desk or with a center or department in the interagency, they're very small. So they have a hard time understanding why there's so many layers of DoD command and why is everybody coming through here. So when you do engage, you want to make sure that it's efficient and it's impactful. Right. So what is it? What's the lead work that's been done before you ever engage with the interagency? And then what's the tangible outcome of this? Right. And not to press on your interagency partners for a tangible outcome, but what's the so what of you engaging? And that's an important thing to go into your engagements with and say, okay, I recognize that their time is short. I need to be efficient. I need to be impactful. And then I need this to follow into something that continues it. The second thing I would say, you have to understand that while all of these folks throughout government service, they certainly appreciate what DoD does, its capacity or its capability, its capacity, the danger that it faces. Many of them even come from military background. They do see DoD, though, as having a role in a certain time and place. And it may not be what you think. So your stated mission may be this, but that may be in contrast to the way that their organization or department or agency feels that DoD should be injecting itself. So you need to recognize that just because you've been given a mission statement, many other people aren't going to, they're not going to recognize it, but they're not going to respect it either, because they just have a different professional opinion on where DoD should be. I would say, and this is a really difficult one for everybody, for all of us, right? Don't apply military pace and pressure to the interagency and the intelligence community. They operate on a much broader topic base, and they have fewer resources. So it can take a long time for them to analyze a problem and get to the point where they're ready to decide on something. So it's very slow to decide. On the flip side of that, once they do decide, it's done. It's implemented, because what they don't have are multiple layers of, bureaucratic chains of command that a concept or a con-op or an XOR take months sometimes to go through. So even though we generally have a decision, we don't implement very fast. So they're very fast to act, and we may be caught off guard. So I think that's an important piece, right? Just don't apply our military pace and pressure in the way that we do things to how they do things, because it will not apply. I think additionally, it's important to recognize that what is your priority, your mission, may not be, it may not be at the top of their list. It may not even be near the top of their list. And I've learned this by interacting with a country team, where, my mission, my priority is counterterrorism. Number one. That's the only reason that I'm there. That's the only reason I exist. And then I start to realize that counterterrorism is about somewhere between number 4 and 7 on the priority of the station and the country team, right? And there's a whole host of stuff that's before that what they don't want to do is they don't want to misalign their, so one, our priorities are misaligned, right? So I'm there for one reason and one reason only. I think it's righteous, and I think that they should be giving all of their time and effort to it, and they don't see it that way. So we're misaligned. We have to recognize that, okay, one, they only have so much time and effort to put something towards something that's their number 4, 5, or 6 priority. But it can also conflict with their equities in those other areas. So your mission may, without you recognizing it, may conflict with something that they're spending a lot of their time and effort on. And so be open to that. I would say, additionally, remember that when you're interacting with the IC, especially, they may be closer to policy discussions than we are in DoD. So whether it's the National Security Council or congressional oversight, the same people that you're interacting with may be the same people that are talking to the committees and talking to the National Security Council. Whereas in most military circles, that doesn't happen. So that's far removed from where we operate. That means that the people that you interact with may be aware of policy direction before it has become policy, before it has become official. And they see where DC is going. They see where the administration is going. And that may not align with the mission that you've been given. It's just they're looking down the road and saying, yeah, this is not going to be supportable very soon. In that vein, they're often a big part of shaping policy. And I say that because there's the regular question that comes out of DC is, what is the IC assessment of, blank? What does the IC assess will happen if this happens? And so those answers that go back from the intelligence community are incredibly important. And a lot of times those answers are being crafted by the same people that you're interacting with. So you certainly need to take that into account and recognize that. I think the last thing that I would say on just individuals, right, is when you interact with the IC or the interagency, is your impressions of how a meeting goes or has gone may not be entirely accurate. So I personally have walked out of the intelligence community and said, that went really well. Right? They seem to really like my ideas and our plan going forward. And I could not have been any more wrong. it was exactly the opposite. They were very corporate in the meeting. They would say, yes, thank you for coming here and talking about it. We had a very pleasant discussion. It's probably that they don't like it. And they don't like it for a number, for however many reasons. But a pleasant discussion at a corporate level with the IC, while necessary, you have to find out after the fact how this really went. You only do that through your embedded L&Os and those embedded officers that you have in there that can then take the temperature of the organization and decide and be able to come back to you with feedback on, well, this is how that meeting really went, right? And so it seems counterintuitive, but if a meeting goes very well, it probably didn't. And they know that, okay, this is not feasible, it's not going to happen, and we'll just simply be able to kill this down the road, right? And the opposite, and then on the opposite end of that, you have, if you get into a bit more probing and difficult questions from the IC and the interagency reps that you're meeting with, right? And they're being not contentious, but they're being aggressive towards you, and they're continuing to poke and draw answers out. And you can walk out and say, wow, that was really frustrating and that was really difficult. But that probably means that you're making progress. And it's that way because in their discussions, they've decided, okay, there is value in this. And now we need to really draw out some of the risks and be able to defend this ourselves. And we need to be able to make sure that there's been due diligence that's gone into the thought process of this initiative or this project that's being put in front of us by DoD. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but I think that you can take it. If it doesn't go well, that's actually somewhat of a good sign, right? That means that they're interested and they're engaged and they're invested. So those are kind of some of the things that I've seen. There is one more. I would say we're very direct with our questions in DoD. When we ask a question, you can take the question at face value. There's nothing really behind it. They have to plan. They have to consider things far beyond just that mission. And many times they'll ask questions not because of the face value of the question, but because they're trying to figure out how this affects something else that they're not even talking about with you, that you don't even know exists, or you have no idea it really, it would be a part of the thought process of this. So you have to, in many ways, see past the question. And when it's asked, think, okay, how does this affect their equities? How does this affect their overall mission? And part of that is by, instead of coming in and thinking, how is DoD affecting the equities of state and CIA and others? It's how is it affecting? It certainly is in some way. It's impacting their mission. It's impacting their equities. It's just a matter of trying to figure out how it is. And in a lot of ways, when they ask questions, you can say, okay, I'm starting to see what they're getting at, what they're really getting at without saying. So that's what I'll pause there. But those are a number of things that I've sort of learned over time that individually we have to become a little bit more proficient at, I think.
No, thanks, Mike. I really appreciate that insight. I think the final question, and then also leave it open for some final thoughts for the audience. But, what's your biggest piece of advice for people if someone's getting ready to get an assignment, working with the interagency, working with allied and partners? How should they prepare themselves?
I think one is seek out anybody that's served in those positions, and it doesn't matter what level, right? It is seek out someone that has spent time outside of our own organization and inside another organization. Like, how do you operate, right? And if you think about it from the perspective of, during the war in Iraq, you could go into any brigade or division TOC and you would see 35 uniformed soldiers and Marines and one person in civilian clothes. And that would typically be the State Department rep. Think about being that person. And you are completely the opposite of everyone else in that room. And when you go into the interagency, they're going to be hyper aware that you're from DOD. But that hyper awareness starts to fade over time as long as you can integrate into their culture. And so you have to talk to people and understand their culture. And the faster that you can integrate into their culture, the more effective you'll be. But you only do that by gaining some personal experience from people that have done it. I would tell you that the relationships are what make everything. And we talk about that a lot. You know, relationships matter, and they really, really do in this case. And in many ways, what I've seen in the IC is they aren't structured the way that the military is, and where we're forced to coordinate with each other and cooperate with each other. In many ways, organizations within the IC and the IA coordinate and cooperate because people have personal relationships. And they say, well, I know Dave. Dave's in charge of this center. And Dave and I served together for years. And Dave and I have a personal relationship. And so let's bring Dave and his center into this. That's exactly how things happen sometimes. So you need to invest in those relationships. I think you've got to go into it recognizing that CIA, State Department, FBI, DHS, they aren't monoliths. They are living creatures of multiple different centers and departments within them. So you have one large umbrella organization with a bunch of different cylinders that feel different ways about things. And they don't always get along. They don't always agree on things. Matter of fact, they rarely do, because depending on the department or the center, they'll have wildly different viewpoints. Now, when an official position of that agency comes out, it will be, widely. It will have been widely distributed as this is the position of the agency. But you have to recognize that within that umbrella, you have all these different organizations that sometimes operate at odds to each other and certainly don't get along. And so you have to recognize what's under the surface. Once you get into that and you take that assignment and you move in, you start to realize here's how these folks feel, here's how these folks feel, and here's how these all operate together. That's an important piece, right? So I would say, culturally, you have to understand the culture of the organization, talk to people that have done it, understand that there are many, many different viewpoints and organizations within any department or agency, and they all differ.
Well, hey, Mike, this has been great. I appreciate you sharing your expertise and your experience with the audience and joining us today. So thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate it, Dave. If we can help one person that's taken an interagency assignment one way, just a little bit, that'd be great. But I really appreciate what the university are doing for our SOCOM operators and for SOCOM in general. And I look forward to seeing more of what you guys produce.
Hey, thanks, Mike. Have a great day.
Thanks, Dave. You too.